Hi everyone, I'm Chief Investigative Reporter Nick Oxner here in the WBTV News Now studio. Appreciate you joining us today as we're about to embark on an important conversation that really revolves around keeping students safe at school, and particularly knowing students, their parents, knowing what your rights are as it relates to reporting sexual assaults and sexual violence and other kinds of violence, frankly, on campus. We have this conversation today in the month of April. April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So an important time to remind ourselves of what our rights are and remind school administrators what their rights are. So I'm joined today by attorney Laura Dunn, who is an attorney who's worked in this space for quite a while, a nationwide advocate, and also someone who's very familiar with the landscape in Charlotte and the local area as it relates to Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools. So hello, Laura. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Nick.
So just set the scene for us a little bit. I don't want to get in deeply yet into the discussion on what people's rights are right off the bat, but I do want you to walk us through a little bit about the laws that we're talking about here, and generally when you think about this space, what are some of the things that you think of from the beginning? How do you approach this?
So, a lot of people have always connected Title IX to athletics. A lot of people know that girls should have the same athletic opportunities as boys, same in college with women and men's teams. And that's normally the extent of people's knowledge of Title IX, but it's actually a federal civil right that prohibits sex discrimination in education broadly. So that has been interpreted to even cover sexual harassment, sexual assault, and very recently, protections for LGBTQ students who are trying to get through school without harassment and bullying that's been all too common. So that's the first thing that comes to mind is Title IX protects pretty broadly anything about sex, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity. You want to be thinking about Title IX and the protections that it offers.
And so, yeah, I find as I've talked about this, you and I have worked together on stories for, gosh, almost a decade. Don't let that make us feel old. But as we've done Title IX stories and reporting, we've talked about these issues. The first thing that always strikes me is I start saying Title IX and people go, oh, the sports law. But it feels to me like that was maybe the discussion around Title IX 15 or 20 years ago when it was kind of new or being newly applied. Have you seen the growing discussion around how Title IX fits into campus safety and sexual violence?
Yes, around, the 2010s, so over a decade ago when we started working together, there was definitely a really big movement, at least at the college level. A lot of survivors speaking out about their experiences, a lot of student activism. The Obama administration took this up, issued Title IX guidance and regulations, and it really was having kind of a heyday for people to realize, oh, this does apply to sexual harassment, sexual assault. More can be done by schools because prior to that time period, if sexual violence happened, a lot of schools just kicked it to the police and said, it's not our domain, we can't do anything. But that would leave both the students involved in these incidents on the same campus, seeing each other all the time. And that was very problematic for the victimized students who often dropped out of school or stopped participating in education in the same way and obviously suffered lifelong consequences from that kind of experience. So the Obama administration kind of came in with all that student activism, all that attention at the college level around Title IX protections, and great changes were made. But under the Trump administration, interestingly enough, there was a change to the regulations, which just the way the Department of Education, the federal agency, enforces this law at the campus level. And in doing so, the Trump administration did something quite progressive. It said that teachers in K through 12 schools are actually responsible employees, meaning if they know about sexual harassment or assault, they have to do something. They have to report it. Prior to the Trump administration, they were not considered responsible employees, meaning they could know about it, sit on their hands, do nothing, and there was no problem. So that was a really big change under the Trump administration that made K through 12 sit up and pay attention. because now they realize we're in trouble. We haven't trained our staff. We don't have written policies, procedures. We don't have Title IX coordinators, someone in charge of making sure the whole school district is compliant with this federal right that's been around 50 years now. So a lot of K through 12s have really stepped up, and I'm finding that parents and students for the first time are really understanding that Title IX may apply to them. It's not just colleges, it's not just sports, it's everyday K through 12 students that have these rights.
And of course, we here at WBTV, and I personally have been investigating Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools for how they handle reports of rapes and sexual assault, reports of sexual violence on campus, including some folks that you've represented. And I think it's important, you touched on something that I think is key to this conversation. It's that there are actual students and human lives that are impacted when they make these reports. So probably a year and a half ago or so, we put together what I thought was a pretty powerful cut of listening to a half dozen students at Myers Park High School who, again, we've investigated these students who had reported being raped or sexually assaulted, reported to both administrators at Myers Park and to police. And nothing happened in any of these cases, in all six incidents, and happened over a period of years. So I think it's important as we talk today, Laura, that we play just a little bit, and I'm going to play out a couple minutes of these young women's voices to put in perspective for us kind of the stakes here. Let's take a watch. What was the culture at Myers Park like when you were there?
Very aggressive. I didn't always feel super safe on campus. I didn't feel safe when I was walking around in the quad between class changes. I think I speak for a lot of women when I say, no, I don't feel safe on the Myers Park campus. Walking around, being on campus at night during football games, I didn't feel safe. You can't walk through the woods because, anything can happen to you.
Teachers and staff and administration didn't take anything seriously.
You're experiencing sexual assault and sexual harassment on a weekly basis?
Daily, I'd say.
Before I was raped, I was sexually harassed every single day, every day, having to deal with people touching me, having to deal with just people saying very crude things to me.
I would frequently talk with counselors, and every single time I talked to them, pretty much I got the same response, and that was, boys will be boys, they're doing this because they like you, don't worry about it. There's this culture where men think that they can get away with putting their hands all over women. And it just makes us feel extremely unsafe.
Going to school every day, I had to prepare myself for what would happen.
And do you think that the administrators at Myers Park are doing anything to help that climate?
No, they just push it under the rug.
I said, I'm being sexually assaulted. I said that to someone, and they didn't even take me seriously.
He told the person on the phone, she's claiming that she was sexually assaulted, and then I heard the guy on the phone say, how do you know she's not making this up?
And I told them what happened, and from the very beginning, the administrators just made me feel like I was doing something wrong.
I was told it wasn't rape. I was told that there was nothing they could do.
One of the administrators would ask me, are you sure that this happened? Do you have a crush? Do you have a crush on the person who did this to you?
I was told that I could even get into trouble if they took the case further and they decided it was consensual.
I was told if I pursue this and he's found not guilty, I would get in trouble for being in the boys' bathroom, and I might get suspended for that.
They told me that if I pressed charges, it would sit on his record for the rest of his life, and basically I would be ruining his reputation.
Did I hear you say correctly that they said you could get in trouble if they investigated it?
Yeah, they said I could be suspended.
They made me feel like I was the one that had to justify myself instead of, I was the one on trial instead of the person who raped me.
Officer Leek said, are you sure about this? Because if you're making a false allegation, charges can be pressed.
It felt like they were against me, and it felt like they were trying to put me on the stand instead of him.
When you went to report to school administrators at Myers Park, did you leave there feeling like you were the one who did something wrong?
They just constantly were reinforcing this idea that I was lying to them.
So you really felt worse off after you left than when you walked in?
100%.
It was like I didn't have anywhere else to go. It wasn't his reputation that was ruined, it was mine.
I felt like I had to suffer in silence because of the way that the school handled it.
I just left there feeling so helpless and so embarrassed.
They kind of made it seem like it was my fault.
I don't think he believed them.
He didn't believe me.
Okay, Laura, so we just listened to what I think are very powerful words from 6 former students at Myers Park High School. And already just in the time that we played that out, we're obviously streaming live across lots of platforms, including on Facebook, and we're getting some Facebook comments and some questions already. So a question that we've gotten in, and if you have questions, people should feel free to weigh in and ask them, is what is the right steps if a student or parent feels like a school or school system isn't taking their concerns seriously? Where should they turn? So let's talk about what are the steps you should take immediately, and what are your options if you have taken what you think are the right steps and don't feel like you're getting anywhere.
Great. So first step, if you believe something has happened to your child, you should immediately report that to the school, because that's how you trigger Title IX. It's how you get this legal protection. It's based on actual notice. So if no one has told the school, the clock hasn't started and the rights don't yet come into effect. So that's really important. And the best way to do that, a lot of parents like face-to-face meeting administrators, no records are created. And you actually need a written complaint to access the Title IX grievance process. The best way is actually sending an email saying, who your student is, your child, what you believe happened, who you believe is involved. It's okay to name the offender in that email. A lot of people worry about that, but that is how you give notice and trigger Title IX, and it's legally protected for you to make that complaint. And you have to sign it. You have to put your name. If you're the parent or the legal guardian of that child, you should put your name on that email, because that's what triggers the Title IX grievance process on campus. That's when you move from just a report to what we call a formal complaint that makes them investigate, makes them take action. The only report, verbally, by phone, some other mechanism that's not in writing with your signature, they don't have to actually do anything yet other than offer supportive measures. So when you put it into writing, it becomes that formal complaint. You ask them to investigate. You say, this is what happened, please take action, sign your name, and that's how you get the Title IX process to happen on campus. And I've seen a lot of parents kind of fall in that gap. They've said something to the school, but they haven't given a formal complaint, and they don't understand the process hasn't started. Title IX needs to be triggered. It needs to be in effect through that complaint. So what happens if you have taken those steps and the school dragging their feet, not interviewing the right people, not giving supportive measures to your child, all the other issues? You can do one of a few things. One, ideally, you'd find an attorney or an advocate to assist you to make sure you know all your rights. Our firm has provided a very brief handout of rights for people to download and access and have a general sense of what their rights and options are, but it's way more complex than those 3 pages. So find someone that can actually help you. You do have a right to what's called an advisor during the campus process. So you don't necessarily need it to be a local attorney. It could just be a family member. It could be a friend. It could be a therapist. It could be anyone who you think will help guide you through that process. But you can elevate complaints to the U.S. Department of Education. That's kind of who checks schools when schools act out of line. So the U.S. Department of Education has the Office for Civil Rights. Ed.gov is their website. If you go there and you type in Title IX, it'll show you how to file a complaint process. It has a template, so you just put in your information, follow the guidelines, and it shows you how to submit it directly to the department. The department can review, decide to investigate, can possibly even facilitate a mediation to resolve your concerns with the school before ultimately coming to an outcome that may be against the school and taking action to sanction them. But the department is the best way to check a school. There are, of course, instances that are so bad, you may have to go to a courtroom. You may have to file a lawsuit and take legal action to assert your rights and those are often cases where damages have occurred. You know, a student has to leave school. Unfortunately, we have K through 12 students commit suicide often. They take their lives because they're not being helped and supported, which is deeply tragic. And so for those more serious cases, you probably do really want to think about whether litigation is appropriate.
So in a lot of the cases that we've covered, both all of the women that we heard from at Myers Park, the students who reported being sexually assaulted at Hawthorne Academy High School, and now even the students that we've looked at, these young 5-year-old girls that we reported most recently, a lot of them have also reported to law enforcement. They filed police reports. Is that something parents should do? Is that something you'd advise them to do? Does that change anything or mess anything up or make anything better? How does that interact?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So when I train lawyers on Title IX, I always start with there's kind of 3 levels of law: campus, criminal, and civil. 3 different avenues. You can use all of them, some of them, none of them. It really depends on the specific situation. So for any situation involving a crime that's occurred, we do encourage people to report to law enforcement. I wish I could say that I was impressed with the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, but having reviewed several of their cases over several decades now, I am not very impressed. I think a lot needs to be done to ensure that law enforcement is better trained on how to respond to sexual violence and how to properly interact with survivors. So if you're a parent and a crime has occurred against your minor child, I do encourage you to report it, but understand that they may want to speak directly to your child, and your child should be in some kind of mental state where they feel comfortable disclosing really intimate details about the sexual incident. And if they're not there, immediately find them therapy, support, counseling, some way to build them up to be comfortable making that report. Obviously, with minors such as 5-year-olds, police can take reports from parents. But unfortunately, at the high school level, my understanding is the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, even if they're still a minor, will make the teenager kind of separately report to them. So there are advocates. I believe Safe Alliance is the advocacy organization located in Charlotte that works closely with law enforcement. And my firm always encourages people to report, because if nothing else, you're giving the name of the offender to law enforcement, and you don't know if that offender has harmed people before, will harm people again. And the most successful prosecutions are when, sadly, there are multiple victims in the same kind of sequence of abuse. So it's always worth reporting, but I'm sadly not seeing as much legal justice through the criminal system as I would want. But that is, I think, a unique issue to Charlotte.
And so you also mentioned that sometimes if you have offenses or cases that are severe enough or serious enough, they can end up in court. You recently had a trial here in U.S. District Court in the Western District of North Carolina here in Charlotte from one of those young women that we heard from, the first that I know of that I spoke with, who reported being raped by a fellow student in November of 2015. Walk us through what's involved with that and how difficult that can be, or what's, if you're going to start this process, what you should be prepared to play out potentially.
I think it's important, if you're thinking at all about a lawsuit, is to talk to a lawyer. A lot of people do get intimidated. The process is so hard, it's so long, it may be so expensive that they don't even find out their rights and options. Always find out. You can decide if it's right for you or not. And it doesn't always have to be a for-profit firm such as my own. There are nonprofits such as Equal Rights Advocates, National Women's Law Center, Public Justice, Legal Momentum, that sometimes can take these cases on. But if you believe that you may have a claim, you speak with a lawyer, they get all that information together. They're going to need all the documents, so be a good record keeper. And then they're going to research, are these claims strong enough? Is there a good chance that we can get through what may be a multi-year lawsuit? Jane Doe is unusual in being, I think, taking almost 7 years before we had a trial from the incident through. Some cases can be quicker, some are slower. It really all depends. But the most important thing to know is you have to keep the evidence. You can't, a lot of times, unfortunately, survivors will like delete messages if they got unwanted pictures. If they've been harassed, they'll destroy it off their phone because they don't want to see it. They don't want to deal with it. You don't want to do that. And there are ways to recover that. So you should act promptly, retain everything, keep all the messages with the school, really keep everything together, try to get police reports, get your medical records, because it's all about documentation. And if the claim can move forward, the first part is just filing something with the court, and it's lawyers kind of arguing, is this good enough to go to trial? They'll file a motion to dismiss, try to keep it from moving forward. But a lot of cases make it past the motion to dismiss and enter what's called discovery. That's when all that documentation is really going to matter. So the parties exchange all their documents about the case. A lot of people are deposed. And I do think it is quite challenging if you're a survivor of sexual violence to go through what's called a deposition. Unlike sitting in court and swearing and testifying, there aren't really limits on what can be asked in a deposition. And sadly, there are certain areas, and Charlotte is one of those areas where attorneys may not always ask the most thoughtful and sensitive questions and may be a little aggressive in how they question survivors. But if you've worked with a good firm, if you've prepared, if you have counseling and therapy and good family support, you can get through those experiences. They'll depose you for almost 7 hours, and unless the court agrees to more time, that's it. And then at the end of that, you kind of put all your evidence together, you send it to the court and say, we're ready for trial. And there's arguments around that point. And if you survive what's called summary judgment, all that evidence kind of comparison, you go to trial. And that's what happened in Jane Doe. And, Jane Doe had to take the stand. Her parents had to take the stand. Some of her friends did, other students did. And they were all quite brave, but it is intimidating to sit in a courtroom, say what happened to you, be fielding questions from opposing counsel. But I can promise you that Jane Doe on day one didn't know that she could get all the way through the trial. That was a learning process where she had to take care of herself, work with counsel, kind of build that trust and ability to get there. And she was able to do it and did so successfully. So try not to be intimidated by the legal process. Find, a firm or an advocacy organization, a nonprofit that you trust and will work through, because it is worthy of pursuing justice. And a lot of schools will settle early. They won't make you go through the whole process, but if you start it, you should be able to finish it. You should be prepared to go all the way to trial if need be.
And again, we're talking with attorney Laura Dunn, who specializes in helping students who have reported being raped or sexually assaulted make sure they know what their rights are. We're having this conversation during National Sex Assault Awareness Month, and we're streaming across all of our platforms. We're taking your questions that you might have. Laura's here to answer those as we continue this discussion. So Laura, the Jane Doe case that finished earlier this year here in Mecklenburg County, or in U.S. District Court, but in Charlotte, ended with maybe not the verdict you would have hoped for, your client would have hoped for. Ultimately, the school district was found not liable for violating all of Title IX. But I spoke with you that night after the verdict was handed down. I want to play a little bit about what you said, because even though it didn't result in money damages being awarded to the school, you said that night, and we're about to hear, that it came with a win in its own right for your client, Jane Doe.
We know for sure Jane Doe was believed, which did not happen on November 3rd, 2015, nor the days and months afterwards. Neither the police nor the school believed her. They railroaded her, and we know that this jury heard the truth, and that's the most important thing. So for all the survivors who see this case and view what happened, it's not a loss. It is a victory in its own sense.
And so as we think about, we've talked about kind of what your rights are, we've talked about areas of redress. Are there, well, actually, let me say this. You are leading a letter of more than 36 experts in this field who, I think today, sent a letter to the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights asking them to consider some new changes and improvements to how the current Department of Education is handling Title IX enforcement. Do you see additional changes or improvements or efforts to address these things on the horizon?
Yeah, so Title IX's been around 50 years, and I would say the last decade there's been so much policy, legislation, enforcement, last 2 decades really, trying to improve the situation on campus for students. But not all of it has been progress. Some of it has unfortunately been backsliding. So I did work with advocacy organizations and attorneys across the country to tell the Department of Education we need to do more on Title IX because of the effects of COVID. A lot of schools really, they lost personnel, they were closed. A lot of issues occurred, right? We're all still reeling from the impact of the pandemic. But unfortunately, survivors suffered a lot. They normally had their cases delayed, resolutions weren't given out. A lot of other issues kind of occurred, and we want the department to do better for these survivors, making sure they have enough time to find counsel to file those complaints. Because if you do file a complaint with the Department of Education, you only have 180 days. That's about 6 months, which is pretty quick for someone suffering from trauma, trying to stay in school, or maybe having to leave school. Lots going on in their life, and they may not always be thinking about their legal options right away. So I've asked the department to think about that statute of limitation, try to extend it to the best of their ability to aid survivors, and also to make sure that there's something called mediation. Not every case has to be an adversarial process where the complainants say one story, the school says a different story, and they have to duke it out, right? That does happen a lot, but surprisingly, a lot of these cases can be amicably resolved between the parties. That just happened with Guilford County Schools, who actually was willing to come to the table with one of my clients and allowed them to even contribute to changing policies so that it would be more effective Title IX enforcement for their K through 12 schools. And it was a really big success, not only in kind of resolving the issue the client had, the high school client had during the campus process, but making it better for other students. So there's a lot that needs to be done to improve Title IX enforcement. The work is not done, but I am very hopeful. I've been working on this for 2 decades now and plan to keep working on it, and I only see it becoming more powerful and effective.
Great. Again, that is attorney Laura Dunn, the founding partner of LL Dunn Law Firm, a woman who has advocated for the rights of students who have reported being sexually assaulted and the victim of sexual violence on campus for a long time. It's Sexual Assault Awareness Month. We've posted or are posting a guide on our website, WBTV.com, that Laura's prepared and her firm is prepared to make sure people have a quick reference guide for what their rights are. Of course, we've worked with Laura and her clients for several years now, investigating Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools and other area school districts and their compliance with Title IX. Laura, we thank you for joining us for today's conversation. For more on our reporting, again, we have a lot of it on this topic. You can go to WBTV.com. Of course, you can watch it across all of our platforms. That's up there on the bottom of your screen. Laura, thank you again for joining us, and thank you at home or at work or wherever you are for joining us today. Thanks a lot.